Welcome to the podcast, Jon Yeo.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me.
The topic today, which is all around data and speaking and what you've discovered in your journey. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to spend with us today. So let's kick off. Tell us in 60 seconds about your entrepreneurial journey.
Look, mine was probably a little bit more accidental than anything. I come up with lots of different ideas in lots of different areas because I'm an observer. I see lots of patterns. And so I make conversations or comments about that. And people says, you should put that in a book, or you should talk about that, or you should turn it. And like, I got asked so much that I almost succumbed. And I developed it sort of organically from there.
It's interesting how so many speakers I chat with end up where they are today through accident or not by sort of deliberate. There's very few that say, when I was younger, I always wanted to be a professional speaker. So it's interesting how those twists and turns we take in life and we end up being a teacher, an educator, and somebody who inspires, which is a real privilege.
Totally. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Jon, I know that you identify as a quiet leader. So I'd like to ask you about introversion and how you've learnt to use that as an advantage, as the superpower that it really is.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I didn't think it was originally. And so if you measure any of those psychometric evaluations, I'm not an introvert, I'm off the scale introvert. So I had some very, very strong difficulties. And then I had a cultural background, Asian background, that meant that you never really spoke to people senior to yourself in any sort of authoritative way. So I had two psychological schisms that I had to overcome. But what I noticed was during the sitting, and this has sort of been proven through data as well, I'm a bit of an analytics guy, that people who are introverts observe more and are able to make more greater quality evaluations. And so that became, on the back of my previous answer, the various ideas that came up in my head became things that I could actually do something with. And I didn't recognize the value of that until sort of a little bit more later on.
It's great when you do have that realization. I've been following the work of the amazing Megumi Miki, also from Melbourne, who does work around quietly powerful leaders. And I work with a fair few introverts and I identify as being introvert myself. And I think once you realize that it is a strength and you can harness that strength, then it does open doors and opportunities. But a lot of it, I think, is around managing perceptions because, as introverts, we don't necessarily speak unless we have something of value to share. We certainly won't speak if something's already been said, and we like to take the time to formulate our ideas. And that can come across to others as we're aloof or we're not engaged or we're not caring. So it's about getting that balance, I guess, while still staying true to yourself. I was brought up, my mum used to say, speak up, come out of your shell as the cat got your tongue, which is a very old English saying. And so I was sort of led to believe that unless you were extrovert, you wouldn't get on in life. So I pretended for many years and just wore myself out through trying to be something that I really wasn't. So it is good that there's this movement around being quietly powerful and about embracing your introvert self and how more leaders and workplaces are becoming more accommodating to the different styles.
We're very lucky that we have a lot more research, data and insights onto the diversity of people in general, including the way we act. And we can observe them more as seasons in the way we cycle through when you need to be quiet, when you need to be a bit more assertive, and then finding that balance for yourself.
I love that analogy of the seasons, Jon. Thanks for sharing that insight.
It's all right. Some people say I'm extroverted, but I think it's just in certain moments I just click into and I kind of go on this, not autopilot, but certainly just know. I eventually worked out, it's probably a better way to put it, when to move forward and when to stand back.
Yeah. I'm the same. I love the stage. I love a large audience, and for some people who sort of think about that stereotypical introversion, shy person who doesn't like people and sits in front of their screen, then often we don't fit that. But as we know, that's not what introversion means. So let's talk about influence. You work with leaders and senior people to help them enhance their not only their leadership and communication skills, but also their strategic influence. How can leaders be more engaging and influential when they're standing in front of an audience?
I think the number one thing that people forget the most when communicating with other people is projecting their intention for what they want out of the conversation without demanding or expecting that person comply. It's the same way that you're trying to convince, a 5-year-old to do something. You've almost got to convince them that this is a great idea for everyone involved. And so I think it's the interest, well, the desire really, and the interest to do that then makes effective influence influential.
Yeah, I agree. You've got to have a plan and then you've got to work the plan. And I think, first of all, in this busy world that we live in with so much information flying around, that the first thing is we've got to give people a reason to even listen.
Totally. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we need to do that up front. So that leads nicely into the work that you've done around analysing data that you came across when you lead TEDx Melbourne. And so what did you find and how have you been able to apply that? It's fascinating research.
Yeah. So I have an IT background, which means I have this kind of analytical nature. And one of the things that I was trying to reconcile in the very early days as an introvert is, what are the speakers that are doing well doing that I can learn in order to be more influential myself? And when I joined TEDx Melbourne in 2009, I was lucky enough to get access to the background data. And back then on YouTube, it used to give you data about when someone would pause, rewind, or abandon a video and return. And so from there, I could sort of reverse engineer what did they do or say previous to that point and work out statistically significant ratios for what caused the most number of disengagements. And then from there, I wound it forward into various models that I developed through that data to help people understand the specific things that you need to understand. There's no one thing that causes it. And so I like to say you need to say the right thing at the right time to the right person in the right way. And so knowing which piece of the right thing at the right time, at the right person in the right way, picking each of those 4 things and placing it appropriately gives you the best chance to have influence and engage.
Fascinating. So you said that YouTube used to. Do they no longer share that
No, they
data?
don't do that data anymore.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that I had to kind of reverse engineer that was then to go to my Zoom meetings and had someone watch expressions on people's faces when they were engaged, when they were disengaged, when they were in chat, when they weren't in chat. If they were in chat, were they contributing to the conversation or distracting away from the conversation? If they were distracting away, were they a significant influencer or was this a minor key party member? And so I had a bunch of people in the background feeding me data in real time. And then depending on what that was happening, I would change the modality, the content, or the framing of the presentation in real time in order to maintain that engagement. And so we're able to shift our net promoter score, which some people might be familiar with as kind of an international standard around engagement. We were able to move it from 45, which was actually pretty reasonable. Most people are happy with 0, by the way, because it's a minus 100 to positive 100. But we managed to get it from 45 to 95.
Congratulations.
Using the same techniques. Yeah. So it was just being methodical and then process of elimination. So it wasn't rocket science, but you had to know what to look for and you had to know what to measure.
So when COVID hit, obviously TEDx Melbourne moved from in-person to a large online event, and that's how you were able to actually watch people's faces while they engage online. Fascinating. Exactly. And so obviously you mentioned those sort of four factors, and it's multifaceted, but was there any one thing that you noticed that was a definite signal for people disengaging? Would there be 1 or 2 things that you can share?
I think there are certain elements in there, especially in Australia. I think the biggest turnoff is ego.
Yeah.
And I don't think people are very self-aware about how they're perceived. So I think that's the most obvious one that I would refer to. And the other one is just like being clear, not only with your intention, which I mentioned earlier, but also clear with your message. If it's clear in your head, it can be clear in your audience's head. If it's not clear in your head, the audience hasn't got a chance. And so I encourage the speakers that I work with to work with finding a way to summarize their talk in a single compelling sentence, which is harder than it sounds. Typically takes about 3 hours, assuming you've got all the information in front of you, to do that, because then you've got something you could really hone in on.
So with all this vast amount of collecting of data and research that you've been doing, Jon, how have you been able to use that data to increase your own level of engagement and influence with the people that you serve?
For me, it's a personal desire to meaningfully engage and connect. What I will do is I'll try and be as objective or analytical or methodical around that as I can, but no more. I mean, you can overdo it. And so all these things that I was doing in terms of analytics and data, I only started with 1 data point, and then I built up 2 data points, and then I worked out 3 data points, and then I worked out how those data points interacted with each other. And I just slowly built this up over time. So it's about being methodical about how you want to do it, and then making sure that that doesn't overtake your desire to be meaningful and engage with those people.
Yeah, I guess it's getting a balance. I'm not data minded at all. I'm the complete opposite. But I spent over 20 years working as a midwife, so I've got sharpened intuitive skills. And sometimes there's that balance between intuition when you're standing in front of an audience, particularly a live audience, when you can look into their eyes and see them. A lot of that thinking and adapting on the fly comes from the gut and the tuition. When to give more, when to pull back, when to move on, when to stop and clarify. And that's what I believe makes online presenting a lot more challenging when we haven't got that. Well, I guess it's data, isn't it? It's data in a different form.
Yeah.
And that can be challenging. That's what I've certainly found personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, your intuition can be sharpened through experience and being methodical, no question. And that's why, knowing the right thing, the right time, etc., then becomes a factor. It's interesting you mentioned the midwifery, because that is a human-centered activity. And ultimately, all communication is a human-centered activity, regardless of the data or regardless of how intuitive you are. It's our ability to find that fine balance. And as professional communicators, I think it's a responsibility for us to hone and sharpen that always.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Jon, in your time as the licensee of TEDx Melbourne and the head curator, you would have watched hundreds, if not thousands, of TEDx talks and potential TEDx talks. So what would you say, if you can share your three top things that you think makes a great TEDx talk, and what do you think the sweet spot is around the length of talks? I know that they've got shorter over the years, and personally I prefer the short, sharp ones. I much prefer the 10 to 12 is my sweet spot. What are your thoughts on the best TEDx talks?
It's interesting you mentioned 10 to 12, because when the website was launched in 2005, the average TED Talk was around, or the typical TED Talk was around 18 minutes. As of 3 years ago, the average time that someone would watch a video before abandoning is 9 minutes. So I would argue that if you've got a longer keynote, that you need to break it down into how do you create impacts at least every 9 minutes, and I would argue even every 3 minutes. In order to maintain the younger generations, because they have a shorter attention span again. That's really what you're aiming for, is how do you make sure you create something that's engaging on a regular basis throughout your presentation. Now, there's a whole bunch of research called Attention Engineers that you can go Google that talks about how casinos used to keep people in the casino, which was then adopted by Google and Facebook as a practice, to the point where they are aiming to hold your attention on their websites for an extra 0.25 of a second. That's the competition we're up against. And we've got to be able to manage and be mindful of that as speakers and communicators. In terms of top three talks, I like different talks for different reasons, but the ones that talk to the byline, ideas worth spreading. In other words, how do you change the way people think and feel about the world they live in? I'm a big fan of a guy called Derek Sivers, Sivers. He has a bunch of really, they are actually about 2 to 3 minutes each, but they're really poignant and clever. They're thoughtful and they're based on first principle. And I'm a big fan of first principles, because once you have first principles, you can extrapolate out. So I quite like the Derek Sivers. And then there are certain classics like Sir Ken Robinson, which everyone else seems to love. So I'm not really original from that point of view. And there's some that are just plain novel. And there's a whole bunch of those as well.
One of my favorites, which is the quirky one about how to fold a paper towel.
Yes, it's
That's,
beautiful, isn't it?
yeah, it is. You know that.
Elegant and simple. Yeah. There's one almost exactly the same called How to Tie Your Shoelaces.
I haven't seen that one. That's one to
Yeah, that
watch.
one. Yeah, and again, and this is the thing. Everyone thinks that you need lots of detail or a complex idea, but both these people do elegant ideas simply in a way that you hadn't thought about before.
Yeah. And they've told them in a way that is compelling and
Yeah,
engaging. So the what, but also the how you tell it, how you get
totally.
that message across. Yeah, the number of TEDx talks I watch and sit through, and at the end I think that was good, but it could have been 5 minutes shorter, or it could have been 10 minutes shorter, and definitely is that sweet spot. And going back to you mentioned about keynotes, I think that it is evolving now that instead of having the keynote where we're talking at people, because nobody wants to be talked at, we're having to add those engagement techniques. So it's almost like a keynote cross workshop.
It is a little bit. The craft of speaking is becoming more important, I think. I mean, it was always important at the top end, but I think the importance for an average leader, for leaders to create that compelling outcome is an important part of their communication strategy, as I mentioned, especially for younger people, or especially online, where you need to make sure that you've really thought this through properly.
Definitely. So, John, what would be one piece of advice that you would offer to somebody who's just starting out as a speaker and aspires to be a professional speaker? If there was one piece of advice.
I think the one thing you can do is back yourself.
In what way?
You've got to be unambiguous about your beliefs in your idea, what you bring to the table, the value you create, and at the same time, don't be attached to it. If the market's not responding, adapt. And I think it's that conviction in yourself, but the ability to respond to what is happening out there is the important balance that we're always trying to find as speakers. And even over time, even experienced speakers should be doing exactly the same.
We have to evolve to stay relevant. And some people, that's a complete reimagination of what they were doing, particularly since COVID.
I mean, dare I say it, the pivot word. I mean, I've totally transformed my own business and my own practice and my own speaking multiple times. But knowing that the knowledge and experience underneath that is going to hold me to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. That's great and really good advice. John, what legacy do you hope to leave? Bit of a deep question.
Well, it is. But I've been really lucky that if you can find that early, that everything else kind of falls into place. And one of the things, even from my earliest memories, is to empower people to reach their full potential and encourage them to do the same for others. And I think it has huge potential in terms of stewardship, ownership, responsibility to what we do and how we operate, but also even in your own small way to make the world a slightly better place. And if each person can exponentially do that, then arguably over time, the law of averages, again, more data, means that the world ends up being a better place.
Absolutely. It's what we all aspire for. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. John, I like to finish each podcast with the same two questions. So number one, can you share a quote or a mantra that you live by?
So the quote I love is David Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and it's, if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life in which he imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours.
Brilliant. I love that. Very wise words indeed. Thank you for sharing those. And do you have either a book, an app, or a podcast that you'd recommend? A classic evergreen one that you refer to often?
A podcast that I always go back to is How I Work by Amantha Imber. She's a psychologist in Melbourne who has not only some great interviewees, but some great research.
Yeah.
And she occasionally does these wonderful participative things where you can actually measure your own effectiveness, productivity, etc. And she uses that data. Well, she gathers that data and sort of shares that as well. So she does a great balance of engagement, poignancy, but also relevancy in modern times.
Fabulous. I'll
Yeah.
definitely look. I remember listening to some early episodes, but I will add that to my playlist.
Yes, definitely
Thank
worth
you for
checking.
sharing. John, is there anything else that we haven't already chatted about that you'd like to mention?
I think the one thing for me is really the privilege I have to have this opportunity to share the messages I have, the experience and knowledge I have, and hopefully help others, in line with my own calling. I really feel like I've found my calling, and I feel blessed to have that opportunity. And so, as long as I can stay upright and keep doing that, I'll continue to do that.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing. John, how can people find out more about you?
If they want to connect with me, LinkedIn is always a
Yeah,
great place to go.
great.
But my website's probably the simplest way, which is
Hmm.
brightstar.net.au.
Fabulous. We'll put all that information so that listeners can reach out via LinkedIn is the best way. Thank you so much for being my guest today, Jon Yeo.
Thank you, Lisa.